Hmm. We have absolutely been fed in some wonderful ways, all about making a difference today, understanding so that we can use our theology, our truth, our teachings to make a difference in the world, starting as with peace. Peace begins with me. The difference that I want to make has got to start with me. And I tell you, our next presenter will help us even more. It's exploring, the title of the workshop is Exploring the Multiracial Experience. The presenter is going to talk to us about defining and discussing race. How do you do that? How do you define and discuss race? What does that mean? Stereotypes of multiracial individuals, colorism, skin tone, hair, physical features, race and health, all of which are outward manifestations of us in our physical form. How does that tie in to what we're learning from our spiritual standpoint, our spiritual teachings? How do we use this? How do we understand it better so that we can make a difference? The presenter is Reverend Dr. Richard Talley. He defines himself as a multi-ethnic individual. His ancestry from both parents' lineage is quite diverse. His father is a Native American, African American, and European, and my mother is Spanish, North African, and Eastern European. I have defined myself as a multi-ethnic individual, partially due to the ancestry and the definitions contrasting multiracial, racial, and multi-ethnic. He says, on my birth certificate, I was noted as a Negro due to the fact that my father, who had dark skin, was with my mother, who was described as white. I was listed as Negro on my birth certificate due to the fact of the one drop rule that stated that one drop of Negro blood determined the individual's race. What was confusing and caused conflicting concepts were the multiple racial identities in both families, and trying to identify with my father's Black skin and my mother's white skin while I have brown skin. Dr. Talley says he became interested in exploring my multiracial history and background while in high school. From that exploration, I decided to self-proclaim my race as a multiracial human being. It was many years later, while studying for my master's degree in psychology, learning the many theories of identity development, that I realized that none of the theories included me. He writes, an individual of multiple racial ancestry. Most of the theories were for monoracial individuals. And so I began to do further research of multiracial identity development theories, and also found that most of them also excluded me. I did find later theories that did include people of multiple races, cultures, and ethnicities. I connected spiritually, both Native and what I learned in seminary to every aspect of my life: artistic, social justice, inclusivity, and diversity, and social equality of all human beings. His dissertation has now become a book, Born Between the Lines, the experiences of a multiracial individual, and he has presented workshops and lectures to religious organizations and civic groups on the topic. We are excited to invite and have Dr. Talley speak to us this day so that we can understand better how we can make a difference. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much.
And thank you for joining us.
Oh, I am excited. It's a wonderful opportunity to be able to speak to people about a subject that has been very, very taboo. And when we talk about the the thing that really separates us when we talk about everybody being one, we're all one. And then we look around and we see all the things that divide us: race, money, education, class, one's sexual preference. We have all these things that divide us as people. But when we talk about multiracial people, we do have to talk about race. So what is race? I'll talk a little bit about how race is used to separate and divide and classify people. I know that the concept of race does not exist outside of our social world, although it has deep roots in our world, in every aspect of our society, in employment, healthcare, education, housing. It is so deep, it has permeated every aspect. But race can also provide a sense of belonging for people for like minds, people living in neighborhoods. It can kind of be a way that people can identify one another and connect with one another. But mostly race is about dominance and power and money and social control and organizing. And the concept of keeping races pure, as if there is any race. If we're all one, then the concept of race and racism is very, it's very outdated. There were, where we lived in Kansas, where our family lived in Kansas, the people in the neighborhood were so upset about having a Black and white man living together that a bunch of armed men showed up on our driveway and called for our dad to come out and talk with to them. And before he did, he gave us all a gun and said, these men look like they might want to shoot me. And if they do, you'll have to shoot them to save your lives. And if I call you, come on out. So he went out, and we could hear the men yelling at us that God hates you, you're godless, you don't belong in our city, you don't belong in our town, all kinds of things like this. And then finally, our dad called us out, and we all, my three sisters and my younger brother and I, went out and were ready to shoot the men. And they left screaming epithets and talking about this and that. But their mark was they did come back, and they at some point poisoned our garden and poisoned our well. So this was all an attempt to keep the races pure. But 99% of all human beings have the same DNA. So we are one no matter what. And no matter how people try to define race and how it separates us, it's a non-starter, because there is one race, and that is the human race. But how do we talk to children about being mixed race? With children have parents of two different colors, or myself, I had parents, one Black, one white. And if I looked at family albums, pictures, there were Black people, there were white people, there were Native American people, and yet we were all defined as being monoracial Black. And this was very confusing as a child, and it still kind of was confusing as we grew up, to be separated. What people could say, well, you're Black, and I could look at my mom and say, yeah, she's white. I could look at my dad and see his dark skin, and yet I could look at my sisters and my brother and say, we have brown skin, and some of us, my wife says, our family looks like the United Nations. I have cousins that have blonde hair and blue eyes, and could not distinguish them from Caucasian people, and others have very Mediterranean looking style, or two actually have Asian features. So when we talk about being multiracial, we're talking about being on the outskirts or the limits of humanity. And we have to come up with our own answers of who am I? How do I exist in this world? Because I was never quite enough. For the people of color, I wasn't Black enough. And for the white people in the community, I wasn't white enough. I did not have enough Indian heritage to be able to be classified as Native American. So I was not enough in anybody's book, kind of a nothing person. And that's kind of what I thought I was when I was growing up. And as the speaker introduced me, saying, yes, in middle school and high school, I decided to start researching my family a little deeper and asking questions of my mother, because by that time our father had died and we left our home on the farm and moved to a larger city in Emporia, Kansas, that did have a multiracial population. And they had two colleges, and there were students there from different nations. So I thought this would be a place where we would fit in. But we were really rejected by all parts of the community, by the Black community, especially because my mom was white and we weren't all Black. And of course, the white community because of our skin color. So I grew up feeling excluded and like no one's land. I think we were described as the Talleys, those half-breeds, or other names like that. So we grew up being racially ambiguous and not knowing how to identify ourselves racially. And even in research studies that had been done, focused on people who were Black, white mix, or a Black Asian mix, but there was no studies or research until recently on the multiracial mix like our family was. So, and another confusing thing about people of mixed race is our skin color. There's this aspect of colorism. Like I said, one of my nieces has blonde hair and blue eyes and would be considered white in any place she went. And other of my sisters and brothers and nieces have dark skin and curly hair, but still it takes a while for people to identify and categorize us. So they kind of look at us, and especially when we're all together as a family, we get a lot of stares and looks and like, but we're used to ourselves. We're used to how we look as a family, and it doesn't seem strange to us. And the fact that people would think that we were different or unusual, or God hates us, as those people said, or we weren't quite human, or we didn't fit in. Those are all kinds of challenges to individuals, especially children. And especially when children have to say, I know that my father is this, my mother is this, my aunt speaks Spanish, or they speak Chinese, and yet I have to classify myself as one race, as monoracial. And that's a huge pressure on people who have multiracial ancestries, is that I know we had to pick one and deny all the other races. As late as 1992, when I went to get my marriage license in Missouri, I checked the boxes that marked my race, and I took the form up to the counter. The lady looked at it and said, we can't give you a license unless you just check one form. And I said, I can't. I am all these races. These are who I am. And she said, I don't care. You just have to check one. And so I talked to my now wife and said, I have to just check one. I checked them all. And she said, oh, wow, that's weird. So you have to deny part of who you are before we can get our license. And so we decided, yes, it's probably smarter just if I checked one. And I probably checked white or this or other. I don't remember what I checked, but I did. But we got our license and got married, and we've been married for many years, and it's been a wonderful, wonderful experience. I am truly happy and very glad to be married to Eileen. And she says the same for me. So I know, I know that we are different races. And even in the Unity Church, we have faced questions. One church we went to, there was actually, for a tryout, there was actually the question, can a multiracial couple minister to us? And we thought, well, what's skin color got to do with our ministry? They did hire us and we stayed, but it was kind of tense to be thought of as different from what we talk about as being one. We are all one. Well, we were not all one because we were multiracial. So we didn't quite fit into their example of what a unity ministry would be about. So we started sending color pictures of ourselves to unity churches when we interviewed. And it does sound strange, but there was one church where we went to, and we knew we were in the wrong spot when we were met at the airport. The people were tentative, they were embarrassed, they were a little frantic, and they did not know how to address us. And this was something that we had decided, wow, so we don't want to be caught in this example again. So we started sending out color pictures of ourselves, which was kind of interesting. But I've had experiences like that, even where we live now in North Carolina. I was going to the grocery store, and I was just walking through the grocery store, and this man came rushing up, and he said, I know you. I know you. You're from the same village that I'm from. You look like all the rest of us. And so I stopped and I told him who I was and what my background was, and that I was born in the United States and had never been to India. And he said, well, you know, you look at me and look at you, we hardly look anything. We look very close. We could be related. And yes, we could have been related, but I think that's more the human condition than a racial condition. And when Eileen and I, my wife, were in California, people would come up to us and they would speak to me in a foreign language. Like they made an assumption that I was from the same ethnicity or culture that they were. And of course, I had no idea what they were talking about. And at some restaurants or places, they would talk to me in Spanish. And fortunately, Eileen understands Spanish and is fluent in Spanish and could talk to them and introduce ourselves. So we did that, but that was very varying, and it made me feel very, very separate. I felt like I didn't belong in this bunch of people because how was I so different? How did my background, my racial background, set me apart? And that's something I think people of multiracial ancestry still are questioning. I mean, how are we introduced? We're not, quote, enough of this and enough of that. And even during the civil rights marches, I went to volunteer and I was told, we don't think you're Black enough to be with us right now. And that really hurt because I know I am Black. I have ancestries that are African. I have ancestors that were enslaved. And in fact, my great great grandfather was enslaved in Tennessee. And after the Civil War, he walked all the way from Tennessee to a town in mid Kansas where there was the government's 40 acres and a mule. And this was land that had been set aside for freely newly enslaved people to come and make a new life. But this land had been formerly a Kansas Native American reservation, but the government in its wisdom moved the Native American people to southern Kansas and to Oklahoma territory, and divided up this land into 40-acre parcels. And my great great grandfather settled on 40 acres of land, and that's where we lived for many many years until our dad died, and with a bunch of young children, there was no way that my mother and us could stay on the farm. But we would always walk around, and we could find arrowheads and pottery, and it was kind of a neat thing to be living where newly enslaved people were making a new start and farming on a place that used to be a Native American reservation. And even though we lived there in this land, we were in the middle of a white community. Our family was one of a few people of color in that neighborhood, that whole area, that community. So did not grow up around people of color. My dad was the only person of color that we were with all the time. I did see people of color on Jet magazine and Ebony magazine and on television, but I did not know how to be Black, how to talk the lingo, the music. My dad was a musician and a former school teacher. And one of the stories that he has as a school teacher was that he had rope marks around his neck. For when he was teaching at a school in Little Rock, Arkansas, a bunch of white people rushed the school and drug him out, put a rope around his neck because they did not want the African American students educated. Fortunately, another group of white people came up, overpowered the group, cut him down, put he and my older brother in the back of a car and drove them from Arkansas up into their family home in Kansas. But he had that mark around his neck, and it was a symbol of how different people think about people of color. They thought it wasn't that Black students did not need to be educated. They did not need to learn how to do math or anything. And I even had one of my high school teachers, because I grew up with dyslexia and ADD, who told me that when you get out of high school, you probably ought to apply for welfare because I don't think there's anything that you can do. Well, maybe I got my doctorate just despite this person, but I don't think so. I think it was just a part of my interest in learning that my dad had sparked in us about reading and learning and questioning, and that was something that he and my mother both instilled in all of our family. And I think everybody but one sister has been through college, and we have multiple degrees because of our parents instilled in us this quest for learning. So that's just some of the experiences. One of the things that I would suspect that multiracial people are asked are some very embarrassing questions. For me, I can't tell you how many times I've been asked, what are you? Where were you born? I was in the same grocery store where this man had thought I was from his village. And there was a lady in front of me at the checkout counter, and she was well-dressed, very attractive. And she, pardon me, she stopped and just was staring. And finally she asked, what are you? And I said, I'm Richard Talley, and I'm a multiracial person of this. I told her my background, racial background, and she looked and she said, biracial? I said, no, multiracial. And she looked again, and then just sort of dismissed it and just said weird and walked away. And the person that was at the counter just said, wow, that was wild. That's interesting. How rude. And I said, yes, it happens all the time. But when I was with my father going into grocery stores, we would be treated so differently. We'd have to wait in line, and he would patiently tell us that, because of our skin color, we're going to be waited on last. So just stand here with me and be calm and quiet, and everything will be okay. And it was. And when I was with my mother shopping, we didn't have to wait at all. We would go through line in regular order, but people would ask me, is that your real mom? Or, are those your real parents? And I've been asked, what are you? So many times. Where are you from? And where were you born? And sometimes just to be honoring when they ask those questions, I'll say, well, I was born in Kansas. And they'll say, no, that's not what I meant. It's like, I don't know what you meant. Do you mean, was I born in the United States? And then they don't really answer. But those questions they challenge my belief in who I am, because I know who I am. I look in the mirror and I see my skin color, and I know my ancestry and my family. And I think of myself as a multiracial human being. I have my DNA, and it proves that I have multiple racial background. I can look at my family albums, and I can photograph albums, and I can see that I have grandparents who are different races. In fact, one of my can't remember what it is. One of my grandfathers was a Civil War hero, fought for the Confederacy, was wounded. And then after the Civil War, probably one of the slave ladies who enslaved people who had nursed him back to health, he married, and they gave birth to my grandfather. And another grandparent, the third great grandmother, walked the Trail of Tears from North Carolina, near where we lived, to someplace in Arkansas, and where she did marry a newly freed, formerly slave person. And that's part of my ancestry also. So I look around and I've made peace with that. It's hard to think that I'm part Caucasians when the Caucasian race has been violent, been rude. It has been cruel to my parents. and I look to see how people are treated, and I think, wow, that's part of who I am. But also, I can't let African American or people of color off the hook, because it has been just as abusive to be attacked by African American people as it is by white people. And our family has been belittled, attacked, we've been separated. Living in a Black community, we were very separate. Going into church, this was one of the things that really was shocking, that people would be talking about love and this, and then they would refer to us as those half-breeds, or again say, well, I'm not sure what God thinks about you. And it's like kind of started me thinking and questioning, what the heck is God, if God if these people are talking about love and how we're all love and we're all this, and then somehow, just because we have different racial background, that we're different, and there's a possibility that God doesn't love us and we'll burn in hell. And it's like, God, for a person who's like 10 or 12, this is very, very confusing. And also, internalized racism is confusing. And if you look, when I was growing up, we could not try on shoes or clothes in stores. My oldest sister, Justine, tells me a story about going to, when my mother would take us to shop in Emporia, Kansas, we would have to guess at the size of shoes or clothes, hold them up to our back, and then buy them. And once we bought them, because we were untouchable, we could not take them back. So even if they didn't fit or perfectly, we still had to wear them. But there was one man in one shoe store who had would let us come in after hours and try on shoes. And this sister also has a story about when she was in high school or in grade school, she made friends with a young white man in her class, and they had a lot of things in common. So they hung out together and they talk and be buddy buddy. And when they would walk around, sometimes they'd hold hands and talk, and they'd eat together at the lunch at lunch. And I think someone, possibly one of the teachers, had told both parents that these two were holding hands and talking together, and they wanted them to stop. So my sister said our parents called her, and they had this long talk about how this boy was white and she couldn't, hold hands with him, and they could talk, but not to spend all her time with him. And he was told the same thing by his parents. And my sister's name is Justine, and we were talking a couple of weeks ago, and she said, amazingly, this young man and her had recently started talking again, and he's happily married, and she's doing wonderfully well. And they both mentioned this incident and how it had changed both of them and their opinion of people of color, or the skin, made them aware of the skin color of people. And I think we notice that as people, we tend to notice their skin color and try to give them a race as quickly as possible. And I'm not sure what that's all about, whether it's trying to make a connection or if it's trying to avoid being embarrassed or avoid being called names or whatever it's all about. But I know, and when people can't identify someone quickly, then they ask what are you, who are you, how are you, where were you born? And my step daughter-in-law, who's Korean, said when people asked her, where were you born? She just tells them Colorado and goes on from there. But it is, I don't truly understand, and this is a part of my work, is to understand why someone's ancestry makes such a difference to people. Why do people care what somebody's ancestry is? And I know there's a part of it that we could see now in the last last several years, pardon me, is that it's about keeping the races pure. And so this was about what segregation is about, and it's about a lot of white supremacists are keeping the races pure, keeping people separate. And there is a lot of fear in the white supremacist, the fear that they will not be the majority population in a few years. And I know I was reading some research papers, and it had the quote that by the year 2040, that the Caucasian race will no longer be the dominant race in America. It will most likely be the Hispanic race, or possibly the mixed race people of Black, Hispanic, Asian mixture. And so I think that's what's got a lot of the white supremacists upset. And it has to do with power and control and domination. But the positive thing about being a multiracial person is, I think, and this will be generalized, I think that multiracial persons may understand people of other races more, because we have that in our background. I know much more about people from Spain and people who lived in the Canary Islands because of my mother's ancestry. I learned more about the Trail of Tears and Cherokee people living in Oklahoma from my ancestries. I know a lot more about being a descendant of slaves from my ancestry. And I draw strength from my ancestry. I'm proud to be a person of color by my ancestry, because my ancestors survived being put aboard a ship, being cramped, being shipped across from Africa to New Orleans or Cuba or wherever, and then being forced to work, maybe underfed and brutalized. And for the women, it was possibly being sexually abused. But my ancestors survived all that. And I look at that and I think, God, what strong people. And that strength, my ancestors' strength, is in me. And for the Native American people, these people walked 1,200 miles through all kinds of weather, and they survived and thrived. And I'm proud that that is a part of my ancestry. I've had to work to make the European ancestry, to be proud of that. But then I can look at people. I have noticed some kind, very strong Urine people who have not been racist, who have been promoting this idea of oneness and that we all are human beings. And I know that there are good people in every race. And in my background, I give thanks for that. And I am proud to claim myself as multiracial, because I know my ancestors. I know where they've been. I know what they've lived through. I myself have lived through many challenges that I think my ancestors gave me that strength. When I was 5, I had my first surgery for premature closure of the sutures of the skull, craniostenosis, and I had several other operations to correct that. And so I've had, would have my head shaved and I have the operations, and I'd go to school with a bald head and big red scars, or wearing a cap or a helmet to protect my head, and I looked different. And so always felt I was always on the outside. And some of the teachers were not better than some of the students, because we lived in a rural area. There was lots of prejudice, lots of violence. And my oldest sister, Eustine, and my big brother, Bob, they protected us. They took the brunt of the violence and really fought for us to have peace at school, and to eat lunch without having it thrown in our faces. So there's a lot of challenges that we, our family, have survived by being multiracial and acknowledging that. We acknowledge our color, we acknowledge our ancestry, and we've been criticized for that. So how can we make bridges? How can we move away from this concept of race and racism and try to categorize people and separate people by their skin color or their hair texture or where they live or where they went to school? And I know these are things that are important, because I think for people who went to an all black school or an all black colleges, um, may be treated differently from a person of color who has gone to a school that is predominantly the majority population. I know when my younger brother was going to Howard University, he said people would really put him down about, where he was going and what he was doing and what he was studying, and saying it was inadequate. And so he did transfer to the University of Maryland, and he said he got a whole different reception there just by going to a different college that was primarily Caucasian instead of one that was primarily African American. So we have all these bridges. How do we start pulling together and being this oneness? Because there's stereotypes of multiracial people, that multiracial people have a mental deficiency, that we are more likely to use drugs and alcohol than other people, that we think we are superior to people of color. And so that that is because of our skin color. And we can't help that. I can't help my skin color. Maybe on some level I did choose my parents before I came to this earth, but from what I've experienced, I think if I wanted an easy life, I would have chosen different parents, or being born in a different country, so I would not have to have lived with this the racism and the taunts and the teasing. And it still goes on. We think, oh, it's 2021 and there's still racism. Well, it's been going on for a long, long while. And part of this racism is now what we talk about, microaggressions. And these are some of the daily experiences that we face. And that could be a look, somebody looking down their nose, or they're making a face, or making a snide remark, or telling off-color jokes, knowing that you're loud, you're there, and they tell it in a voice that's loud enough but you can hear their off-color joke where they talk about, oh, let me tell you about this colored person here. And they won't use that. They'll use a more derogatory name. And so they'll go ahead and tell their jokes and then they'll laugh. And so it's very tough. It's not an easy thing being a person of color or a person of mixed race in this country. And I think the stereotypes that, if you're mixed race, you're likely going to be, difficult to count on because you'll want to flip race at some point. You'll declare yourself white, black, this at the drop of a hat, and you want to change your identity. And because of the racism, that we want to avoid any confrontation. But can we really change this concept of racism, and prejudice? And if we can, how do we do that? How do we transform the concepts of race and multiracial people? I feel excluded from people of color. I know when we went to the NAACP, I was treated very differently than my wife, who was white. She was treated and introduced and embraced, and I was left on the outside. And it's like, well, and so I quit going. So my skin color seemed to make a big deal of difference. And I've had to proclaim myself monoracial because, as was read earlier, that on my birth certificate is Negro Black. I was ascribed Black forever and am still ascribed as Black. But that's not all of my identity. I am Black. My ancestry is from Africa, and my dad was an African American. So I know that. I'm proud of that. I look at his accomplishments and my ancestors' accomplishments, and I'm not ashamed to be Black or Native American or Spanish or any of that. It's who I am. But can we as a society accept how multiracial people self-identify and allow people to identify whatever their life experience is, because that's how we identify. It's called the ecological system of identity, because wherever we grew up in our family, the neighborhood, the community, if we were accepted as human beings, we likely will have a broader concept of ourselves. And if we were looked at as monoracial people, then we would have to deny part of who we are. And that's what I've had to do. And that's what my book, Born Between the Lines, is about, is for many years, I've had to deny who I was. I had denied that I had Native American ancestry. I had to deny that part of my ancestors were white and that part of my ancestors came from Spain and from Portugal. So I've had to deny all that. So it made me feel less than. And I have been working very hard. That's why I went in to get the PhD in psychology, to try to resolve within myself, who am I? That has been my question. Who am I, and how do I relate to people of all races, so that I can say and genuinely believe it, that we are all one. We are all human beings. We are all God's stuff. And when I say I believe that we're all one, I look past the superficial stuff of skin color, hair texture, and look for the essence or the spirit within human beings. And that's what's important to me, is that spark of divinity that's within us. And that's what makes us human beings. So I thank you very much for
Ah,
allowing me to talk. And
Dr.
I,
Talley, we thank you for
all
sharing,
right,
for
yes,
being so open with us and helping us to understand your experience, which will help us to absolutely look to that divinity, to be guided by that divinity as our truth. You have a question being asked of you. When I worked at the YMCA, our staff was identities. And so were the people who were members: Black, white, rich, poor, gay, straight. Not quite a question, but any thoughts about, I guess, I'm not sure what Marlene was attempting to identify or ask.
oh, maybe she was just saying that had worked in an environment that was very accepting.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as we look at what's happening with the population that of gender, of sexuality, that's people who have different sexual orientations, that we see there's quite a spread in that from uh,
Male to female.
from male to female. We have the transsexual, we have transgender, we have people who call themselves biracial, and I even have a friend who calls herself, she has said, I am asexual. So that same variety that goes to with sexuality, I think also can go with people's race, and that we can say, yes, I am proud to be this or that without having to put another person down or
Mm-hmm.
to demean a person to be who we are. And I think that's what our history is that people of color have been demeaned and have so many negative stereotypes that still surround when we go to apply for a job. Those stereotypes uh, come up. They're lazy, they're this, and they're not human beings. We are not human beings. We're more our skin color and those stereotypes. So are there more questions?
Yes. Do you think, Reverend Dr. Joanna asked, do you think it is important to ask people as how do they want to be identified rather than assume their ethnicity?
Yes. And I think there are ways to do that. That's been one of the things that I've been talking with my wife, Eileen, about, is I'd like to be correctly identified instead of being racially misidentified. So if somebody comes up and they ask me, I can't tell exactly what race you are, and I'd like to address you correctly. What do you prefer? And so I do tell them, and I don't feel that that's so much better than being asked, what are you? Where were you born? But when people come up and they genuinely say, yes, I'm curious. I want to be able to be correct in my naming of you, or my talking and my recognition of who you are.
Mm-hmm.
And I think for ministers and spiritual people, I think that's so important, because in many churches, I have just been assumed I was this or I was that. One lady even said, oh, when you started talking, I thought you'd be speaking with an accent. And it's like, oh, okay, well, those things hurt. They do hurt, diminish who we are.
Couple of other questions. One is, how about Black History Month? What's your thinking about that?
I think it's a wonderful month. I think it anybody who has Black heritage or Black roots should really celebrate that. I wish it was not just a month, but maybe the whole year we could celebrate all the things that Black people have done, people of color have done besides sports and this. It's like the ladies that worked for NASA. They're the medical experiments that have been done. I can't remember the names right now, but the work on genetics has been done by people of African heritage. So I think people of African heritage have contributed so much to our society.
Another question is from Paula, and she says, in Kenya, people tend to self-identify along tribal lines, and the country has worked hard to keep Kenyans identify as Kenyans rather than by their tribe. Is there a downside to self-identification by race?
Yes, I think so. Because we ignore all that we are. We're more than just our race. We are intelligence, we are creativity, we are inspiration. We have gifts and talents that we can share with the world. And when we look at ourselves as simply a racialized person, we miss 90% or more of who we are. We miss that creativity and that individuality and that spark of divinity you were talking about that's within us.
I have a question. You mentioned internalized racism, and I would ask you, have you had to confront that within your own self, and if you did, how did you overcome it, or how are you overcoming it?
I've had to confront it within myself because I've experienced racism and trauma from Black, white, Spanish, and Asian people. And one of my therapists said, I can't believe you're not hating people. And I said, I think it was because of my father, who just said, whatever people do, remember it's not about you, it's about them. And you just cannot waste your time hating someone for what they think or what they believe. So you have to know who you are. And that's something that he talked to us about constantly, believing who we are. And if someone called us derogatory names or did this, he would come and say, in the grocery store waiting, this is the rules, but we are who we are. We're going to act respectfully and talk respectfully. And he got a lot of respect from people who would initially put us down, but when they saw how he treated everybody with respect, he was treated very differently. Yes.
It is great that you ended up on a very basic New Thought principle that you give out what you want to get back. You don't accept what's being given to you all the time.
Absolutely.
So we thank you so much, Reverend, for being with us, for sharing with us your very personal experiences so that we can be able to make a difference in the world just by what you've helped us to understand today.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
No, kiddo. Okay. Thank you.
Bless you. All right.
Yes. And we shall have our final 15-minute break. You will want to come back. Paula Languth Ryan will absolutely just inform us and educate us and inspire us as she closes out the conference, the last workshop. It will be great. We will see you in 15 minutes. Let me mention, if you haven't, you have 15 minutes to register for the Congress. You have 15 minutes to register for the Congress and have the 25% discount, or you have a few minutes to register to donate to INTA to enable us, since I'm a working member of INTA's board, to help us to ensure the mission and to ensure that it's implemented, that every member of the human family will know a little bit more about New Thought principles.